Hello, everybody. My name is Luke Menzel. I'm CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar this evening, Australian time, facilitating credible business decarbonisation. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm standing on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and of course the owners of the lands of all our participants and viewers on this evening's webinar, wherever you're joining us from right around Australia. We're coming together at an important moment. Globally, 2023 has been a really significant year for business transition planning, with a number of really critical frameworks being released and finalised that are all designed to support consistency and transparency and the robustness of business decarbonisation. And we'll be hearing about some of those over the course of the next hour or so. It was also a significant year in Australia, with the government confirming plans to introduce mandatory climate disclosure for very large companies in FY25 and rolling out more broadly across the economy subsequent to that. And of course, we're also on the cusp of COP28, in which one of the key issues under discussion is going to be the global stocktake, which seeks to measure progress against the ambition set out in the Paris Agreement. And while the political discussion is yet to take place, the technical report was released back in September and confirmed what was very clear, which is we are a long way away from the kind of actions and implementation that would see us hit those Paris targets. Certainly a long way away from the kind of emissions reductions we need by 2030 to keep that 1.5 degree target in place, which underlines how critical it is that we use every tool in the toolbox, including giving businesses, investors and the folk that advise them really clear tools and information that help them make decisions that will allow us to accelerate this transition. So tonight we're going to survey the landscape. The last time we took a really deep dive into this was back at the National Energy Efficiency Conference back in May. There's been a huge amount that has happened since then. So we're going to reflect on that. And we'll look forward to COP28, which is just about to kick off in Dubai, and indeed forward to 2024 and some of the things that we should be watching as we collectively progress into this next year of this critical decade. So we're very lucky to have some of the best in the business with us this evening: the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, the Investor Group on Climate Change, ClimateWorks Centre, and representative of my own team at the Energy Efficiency Council. Just some of the organisations that have been collaborating very closely and effectively on this topic. I'm coming at it from different perspectives, but have a group of organisations that have found common cause and are, as I say, working very closely together to ensure that appropriate disclosure regimes and indeed transition planning is really a core to the business journey. And they're here in Australia. We'll be hearing from all of them in a little while. I encourage you, as we work through this webinar, to pop your questions in the chat. There'll be an extended Q&A and discussion with the full panel at the end of this session. But before we hear from all of them, it's my great pleasure to welcome Jacques Morris, who is the team leader of the Transition Plan Taskforce. We were really lucky to have Jacques with us in Australia for our conference back in May. He spoke there, as well as at a number of other events, some of which were hosted by some of the partners on this call. It was a really impactful week and really helpful in terms of building literacy around the work that the UK Transition Plan Taskforce has been doing for some time now to really establish what we mean by transition plans and the role they play in those broader disclosure frameworks. When we last saw Jacques, the TPT framework was in draft form. That story has progressed somewhat, but I don't want to steal his thunder. Please welcome Jacques Morris, and he'll tell you some of the important work that's taken place over the last 6 months. Thank you, Jacques.
Thanks very much, Luke, and good to be here. It is genuinely a real pleasure to be back and having this conversation with you all again. I know it's late for you guys in Australia, and also just to be talking again with ClimateWorks as well, with IGCC, and with ASFI. There is so much that we are, so much going on in Australia that we are looking on keenly in the UK, as an example of a jurisdiction that is really moving quite quickly. And everything that I'm going to speak through today is also just more of an example of how quickly this space is moving. It was only in May that I was in Australia, but since then, I mean, it feels like it's been at least a year. Because, as you said, Luke, there's so many different frameworks and pieces of guidance that are trying to move this space forward, all in a really complementary way. And that's a really key point. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the Transition Plan Taskforce, the TPT, and how we've developed a gold standard for transition plan disclosures. So if we go to the first slide, please. So the TPT was set up about 20 months ago, and we are nearly at the end of our 2-year mandate. So the Transition Plan Taskforce is a group of CEOs and officials from government and regulators and the Bank of England, all coming together to try and figure out what does a good corporate transition plan look like. And that task really has brought together over, I think, 150 organisations within the UK. It's supported by a secretariat. I lead that team. And we've really been trying to bring everyone together to figure this out, because there's so much demand in the UK and globally for a standardized way of expressing what a business's transition plan is. And the standardized element is really important, because we know that some companies are starting to issue plans about how they're going to get to net zero, but there's not much consistency between those plans, which makes it really difficult for users of those plans to then be able to judge how they're doing. So for regulators, for example, they need to be able to see, all right, which firms are delivering on their strategies, which parts of the economy are moving in the right direction. Policymakers will also have a similar lens. For investors, they really want to see a layer of information that is basically currently missing across the market to be able to better inform their capital allocation decisions. So banks for lending and investors, they really want to be able to see, to be able to judge between organizations that they might be investing in or lending to, and to also understand the risks that they are exposed to through their own lending and investment. And then for corporates themselves, transition plans are a blueprint to reaching a target. They are a means of understanding the specific steps that will be taken, and a way of articulating that in a very standardized way for this variety of users. So the TPT was set up to do this. We have published a final disclosure framework, which I'll speak to in a minute. And I think just two very important points. So this is informing regulation in the UK. So the FCA, so the Financial Conduct Authority, the securities regulator in the UK, and the UK government will consult on transition plan requirements, like the Australian government is starting to do at the moment. And that will be informed by this work, by the TPT. And we're also aligning internationally. So this disclosure framework that we created was designed to build specifically on the International Sustainability Standards Board's final standards, which came out a few months ago. And then that as the global baseline, and then the TPT builds on top of that with transition plan guidance. So if we go to the next slide, please. So a little bit on who we are. So this is the steering group, which is essentially the task force. And you can just see a flavor here of the sorts of organizations who have been involved so far. So we've got some really big names here. So Aviva, major insurer in the UK and Europe. We've got Legal and General Investment Management, NatWest Bank, as well as corporates like Unilever and Orsted. And then we've got, as I said, the financial regulators and supervisors in the UK, as well as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, and the International Sustainability Standards Board. They then oversee the work of 11 working groups across a number of sectors and a number of topics like adaptation and just transition and nature. And all of that work has been funneled into creating the final disclosure framework that I'll speak through today. So next slide, please. So this is it. This is the piece that we published last month. So on the left is the disclosure framework itself. And then there is a whole raft of guidance. Now, even though that this was developed in the UK, it has been specifically built with the international lens in mind. So we have done a very, very careful technical mapping to the global disclosure standards from the ISSB. So in particular, for those who are really in all of the financial accounting standards world, IFRS S2, as well as TCFD and European standards as well. So we really wanted to demonstrate to organizations who are starting to develop their transition plans, okay, how does this really fit in with other sort of compliance requirements that I might have or other frameworks that I'm starting to use. We also published some legal considerations for transition plan preparers, talking through, all right, how does this fit within legal frameworks? What's the role of directors' duties in terms of transition planning? How should I consider competition law? So we really wanted to place transition planning within the wider ecosystem. And then on our website, on the right-hand side, we've got a bunch of implementation guidance as well that talks you through, okay, what are the key disclosure recommendations? What do they mean? Why are they important? And there's also a bunch of case studies there too to help transition plan preparers move through the transition planning journey. And if that's not enough, we also, a couple of weeks ago, published some sector guidance too. So for these 7 sectors, which we identified as particularly important in transition, we have published guidance which layers on top of the disclosure framework, which allows preparers in that sector to say, okay, I've got this sector neutral disclosure framework, which is going to help me think through the fundamental things that my transition plan should include. And then I've got this sector guidance that goes on top of that, that says, how do I interpret that for my sector? So we picked these 7 sectors and we really looked at what is the emissions intensity of these sectors. We looked at what is the investment gap required to move these sectors. And then we also had a look at the guidance that was already out there for these sectors and came to a conclusion that transition plan guidance specifically was not necessarily either high quality enough or very useful. So what we did is we looked at the whole picture of guidance and then we produced these pieces. These are out for consultation at the moment. That's not just for response from UK companies and firms. We really want to have an international picture. So I know that you've got, I think it's 5 days left on the Treasury's Sustainable Finance Strategy consultation. If you can also squeeze in a response to ours, it closes at the end of the year. So we'd really appreciate feedback on that too. And you can find all of that on our website. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the detail. So as I said, the International Sustainability Standards Board, that's the box at the top, provides the global baseline for sustainability disclosures and climate-related disclosures. You might also be familiar with the work of GFANZ, which has produced transition plan guidance for real economy companies and also for financial institutions. And then the TPT's work, you can see, is summarized within the green boxes below that. And we really see the TPT as fitting into the international landscape by providing further depth and detail for transition plan preparers. And then at the bottom, we've got the sector-specific guidance that I just spoke through. So when preparers are approaching transition plans, they should first look at the ISSB, and they should first look at those requirements, which are fairly high level. And then they might look at GFANZ and then TPT in order to get really into the detail. And then we think that this approach will allow for international consistency and allowing companies to understand where each of these pieces of guidance fits within the system. So next slide, please. And thanks, Holly, for posting those links in the chat. I do encourage everyone to have a look at those. So if we start thinking through what are the key recommendations of the TPT. So on the left-hand side, we've got our 3 key principles that we'd like to see in transition plans: ambition, action, and accountability. So ambition is really about your overall target, your overall ambition. So this might be your net zero target. It might also be different targets relating to nature or biodiversity, or to climate resilience. And then we also want to see the action behind that. So how is the firm actually going to operationalize this? So taking that overall ambition and translating it into some key concrete short-term steps. And then accountability. How is the firm going to hold itself to account? How can others hold it to account? So what does the governance look like? How is it going to be reporting on its plan? And these 3 key principles run across the whole framework. And they're there really to just guide people in terms of understanding what this is all about. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a key concept that the TPT has developed, which is what we call taking a strategic and rounded approach. And there are 3 layers to this. So the first is on decarbonising the entity. And this is what I think we might typically think of when we think of what is a net zero transition plan, or how do I get to my net zero target? We might summarize that as decarbonising the entity itself. And then in the green swirl on the right, we talk about responding to the entity's climate-related risks and opportunities. This is where a lot of the existing work from TCFD comes in. So how do I understand the risks and the opportunities that are posed by transition risks or physical risks to my organization? And how do I take that into account? And then finally, at the bottom, we've got this idea of contributing to an economy-wide transition. And I really think this is one of the most important parts of the whole framework, because this is where we really start to recognize that firms are not decarbonizing by themselves completely. They are part of an interdependent system within the market. And they need to think about, where do I sit within that system? How do I contextualize my actions? Are the actions that I'm going to be taking, are they going to be benefiting the economy-wide transition? Or are they just going to be benefiting the decarbonisation of my own balance sheet, for example? So for financial institutions, this might mean, I could just divest from all of my high carbon assets, and then I could just, leave those to another party to take forward. Or I could think about holding onto those assets and using active stewardship and really thinking about phasing them out in a responsible way. And that's the sort of thinking that we want to try and encourage with the framework, is how do I contribute to the economy-wide transition? And I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there. So the TPT's approach is moving from beyond just target setting and achieving a net zero target, and then really thinking about the interdependencies within the system. And it's that sort of system change that we're going to need in order to get to net zero and to climate resilience. So let's go down one level deeper now. So this is the framework itself. So every time we talk about the disclosure framework, we're basically talking about this grid here. So at the top, you've got the 3 principles that I laid out already. And then you can see how those filter into a set of disclosure recommendations. So if we start on the far left and then we'll move through. So first of all, foundations. So this is where I spoke about how are you setting out your overall strategic ambition. And then within that definition of strategic ambition, we also encourage firms to think about what are the impacts and the dependencies of the firm's actions on nature, on the wider, on wider society, on communities, on specific stakeholders. So we really want firms to be understanding that and then setting it out at the very top of their transition plan at a high level. We then want to be seeing disclosures around what are the impacts on the business model and the value chain. And then also in box 1.3, what are the key assumptions that the organization is taking? And then what are the external factors that might affect its transition plan, be it, the change in climate or political implications, or general market forces. We know that transition plans are going to iterate, they're going to change over time, and companies are going to have to flex with that. This isn't just one and done, this is an ongoing process. So having an understanding of the assumptions and the external factors at the very start is really crucial. We then get into the second element, implementation strategy. So what are the changes to the business's operations? This could be stuff as simple as, are there going to be changes in physical sites and resourcing? How are the products and services offered by the organization going to change? What are the policies and the conditions internally that support that? And then in box 2.4, how is this all going to be resourced? What is the financial planning around it? How does the transition plan fit within the organization's financial planning? And we know that this is quite tricky, but it's crucial information for investors who want to see it. The third area is engagement strategy. And this is so important, especially when we think back to that idea of contributing to the economy-wide transition. So how am I engaging with my value chain? How am I sharing best practice? How am I supporting the transition through the value chain? How am I engaging with industry? How am I engaging with government and the public sector? You might interpret this in an Australian context at the moment to being, all right, well, I'm going to respond to the Treasury consultation and I'm going to tell them the sorts of policy signals that I need to see to support my own transition. We think this is also just really important to have that continuing dialogue so that we have governments and industry both speaking about what they need. Then we get into metrics and targets. So this goes beyond just your greenhouse gas emissions metrics and targets, but it's really the overall set of KPIs that will be used to measure progress against the transition plan. And then we've also got a piece in there around carbon credits. We don't have any specific guidance on carbon credits because that's very much been developed by others, but we do encourage transparency around how credits are being used and what for. And then finally, the fifth piece here is governance. So what does board oversight and reporting look like? How are management roles taking into account transition planning? How is a culture across the whole of the organization really embedding the plan? And then how's it linked to incentives and remuneration? And how are the skills, competencies, and training of the organization being developed to support it? So this is really a very holistic way of considering the organization's transition plan and crucially setting that within overall corporate strategy. This isn't something that's done in a corner of the business. This is something that's done very much across it, that brings in all of the corporate functions within the business and has clear oversight from the very top. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just I think probably my last slide, just a comment on how momentum is building internationally around transition plans. So there are some, there's a crop on the right-hand side, which is from a report that we published in July, but it's actually already out of date because things are just moving very quickly. So for example, the Australian box doesn't reflect the latest Treasury consultation. And then we've got advances in the EU as well. And then also since this came out in the US, the Treasury published some principles for net zero financing, which basically said, if you have a net zero target, you also need to have a credible transition plan. So in different political contexts, we are seeing governments and regulators really trying to understand what transition planning means for their jurisdiction and putting in place some requirements. And it's really that pivot to regulation, which is now going to really help move transition planning into the next stage. I mean, overall, my reflections here are that in the last nearly 2 years that we've been doing this, the conversations around transition planning have just exploded. And I'll be at COP28 in about a week's time. I know that others, Luke and Holly from EEC, will be too. And I'm already expecting to see dozens and dozens of events and speeches on transition planning that wouldn't have happened a year ago, and certainly not 2 years ago. So we're really seeing this whole concept being embedded into the international discussions on basically what is the role of the private sector in supporting the overall transition, and then how are governments putting in place requirements to really strengthen that role. So I think I'll probably stop there for now. But I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Luke.
Hey, thanks, Jacques. I maybe have one question for you before we let you have a little break. This is a conversation, as you say, it's moving incredibly quickly. And one of the great strengths of the UK's effort has been that it has sort of engaged an incredibly diverse group of stakeholders, taken them on that journey, but also this fulsome consultation process. So you had the draft framework out there for quite some time before finalising it. I'm just interested, what were some of the key things that changed from the initial draft to the final framework that you released in October?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So I think for starters, the first thing to say is we ran this consultation and we just had overwhelming support for the framework. Yep. And companies were not saying, we shouldn't be doing this. This is the wrong direction of travel. They were saying, okay, this is a great framework to help us get us going. And, we need a bit more guidance on some of the pieces, some of the how-tos. So two things that changed within the framework. The first is that at a foundational level, we put nature and just transition and climate resilience in there because we kept on hearing from the market, we are thinking more and more about these areas and we need to understand how they link to our net zero plan. So we really brought that in at the very start. And then the second thing, I think, is that we just had more calls for more case studies, more companies saying, all right, we get the concepts. Can you give us a little bit more tangible information about what this looks like in practice? So on our website, we've put in a bunch of written and video case studies that are there to help companies hear from other companies how they're actually doing it. Because I could talk for days about all of this, but fundamentally, it's not about me. It's not about the TPT. It's about companies leading the way and showing others how to do this.
And I suppose in terms of that sense of the grounded implementation pathway, your new sector guidance is going to be the next step on that journey of kind of companies being able to really get their head around what it means for their particular industry, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the disclosure framework should apply across all sectors, and it's a great place to start. But then we know that for some sectors, for example, we've released this guidance on food and beverage, which really looks at the whole food system and the whole supply chain there, and how each of those independent pieces need to work together. And we came across some just really interesting discussions with farmers' unions, for example, around all of the data and the disclosure requirements that are landing on farmers and how can we make those more consistent. So we just uncovered all of these areas of the system where further guidance is going to be helpful to overall support quality transition plans.
Well, I'll do what I promised and give you an opportunity to, I don't know if you've had breakfast yet, but this would be your opportunity to wolf down some cornflakes or something there in London. Jacques, thank you for that presentation. We'll get you back for the panel in a little bit.
Thanks, Nick.
This is also the opportunity to hear from some of our wonderful partners in this space. And first up, we have Amy Quinton, who is the Senior Manager for Policy at the Investor Group on climate change. Hello, Amy.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And you've obviously a long-standing champions of the role of transition plans in the economy and really understand the value of them for your members, the investors that will in large part finance this transition. You've recently released a report on that topic. Can you tell me why you felt like you needed to kind of pull that sort of story together in this, short, sharp kind of explanation of what the role that transition plans can play for investors and then what's in the report?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Luke. And it was really great to hear that snapshot from Jacques to really set the scene today as well. So very supportive of firm level corporate transition plans. And this most recent report actually zooms out. And so think about everything that Jacques just said, but apply it at a sector level. And that's what this latest report is really focusing on. Previously, we've also dug down into why corporate transition plans are so important to investors, and we can sort of circle back on that. But this particular one actually responds to a survey we did of our members. And so for a bit of background for those on the audience, Investor Group on Climate Change, our member base is particularly institutional investors and the sort of supporting service providers in that space. And the overwhelming feedback of our that sort of response to that net zero investment survey was that actually getting these sector plans in place will be really important to support investor decision-making and engagement with companies, and also importantly to support companies to produce their credible corporate transition plans in line with the TPT guidance in the Australian context. And so off the back of that, we've commissioned this particular work led by Kronos Sustainability and Dr. Ian Woods. And it also builds off the recent announcement in Australia from the Australian government to develop sector plans for 6 priority sectors.
Yep.
And so this will be very complementary to the corporate transition plan work. And so I'll just spend a few minutes just sort of giving a quick snapshot of some of the key areas, and then we can very happy to take questions in the panel at your lead, Luke. So yes, pretty much take what Jacques has just said on the corporate level and zoom out to the sector level, and you'll see where we're focusing in on this report. The Australian government has announced that it plans to develop 6 plans across for the sectors across electricity and energy, industry, the built environment, agriculture and land, transport and resources. And these plans, importantly, they're not just a sort of another scenario or pathway exercise. That's an important element of it, but actually it's the combination of policies and sort of the overall view from the federal government on how we're going to get to a just and orderly economic transition, and how companies can then, within those sectors, can really utilise that plan to make actionable decisions, and of course in our context particularly around investment. So this report looked at what the role of sector plans, what they can do and their importance to investors, importantly what they're not. And then it really also dives into more deeply on how investors plan to use these sector plans, and investor expectations for these plans. And this analysis is the first of its kind that we've seen, providing that investor perspective on why these sector plans are so important. And so for those on this call, we'll be coming at this from different perspectives, whether it's providing advice across these different sectors, energy and electricity, or more widely, or perhaps working directly within these sectors or in the investment community or finance space more broadly. So I think this is a really good time to have this conversation, because government consultation over the next 12 months would be really important to hear from a right range of voices, and that broad consultation and input into that process will be really important. So we know that these different sectors will go at different speeds in the race to net zero emissions. Each sector needs different policies to deliver this least cost abatement, and but ultimately all the sectors need to add up to the national objective. And so I think the message from the UK Transition Planning Taskforce guidance on sort of thinking about how this fits into the bigger picture and how it all sort of adds up towards this economy-wide transition is really essential at the sector level as well. And so this work that we did looked at particularly some of the sector pathways that will the elements of the sector pathways that will inform these broader plans, which are much more than just the transition pathway. And also really dug into sort of how investors were thinking about these plans. And there were sort of, I suppose, 6 key areas that actionable plans are expected to achieve. First one is to drive economic growth and attract investment into transition opportunities. Help investors avoid stranded assets and allow them to allocate capital confidently. And also remain in assets that need capital in transition and provides clear signals on green investments. So again, going back to Jacques' comment, picking up on, it's not just about divesting, sort of moving capital today into everything and your portfolio looks great, but it's actually about how we invest through the transition. And really sort of reduce those risks and maximize the opportunities, and ideally really keep those, really support those sectors that we need in the net zero economy, and in our regions. So also, again, building on some of Jacques' comments, these sector pathways can help companies to develop better transition plans and also allocate capital into climate solutions. The fourth point is really about building a common understanding among the various actors that play a role in this transition, and that includes government, the public, companies, investors, by clarifying this collective task ahead to achieve net zero emissions. Fifth, to minimise the sort of disorder that we're seeing in this international disorderly transition. There's always going to be a level of sort of disorder, but this can really help to minimise that and empower Australia to take advantage of in this global race to clean energy and adaptation. And then finally, supporting a just and orderly transition by assisting workforces and skilled planning and investment in these transitioning regions. And it's really great to see just transition coming through as an important theme in the UK TPT guidance. So just briefly, what sector pathways are not? I've already mentioned they're not just a scenario to consider. They're actually, or sector plans, I should say. They're not just another scenario, but they're actually this overarching group of policies and actionable measures that will get us to our each sector to this economy-wide objective of a just and orderly transition. They're also not fixed forever prescriptions of the future, and the same point that applies to corporate transition plans applies here. These are dynamic, so they will need to be reviewed over time. But what it does provide us is with that common understanding of what we're working towards, and that can be updated over time. It's not changing how responsibilities for climate action are allocated. It's not shifting responsibility from a company to the government, or from an investor to the company. Everybody has their role to play, but it's providing that sort of common reference point. It's not a replacement for really important policies like the safeguard mechanism. Rather, the safeguard mechanism might be one of the policies that feeds into to the sector plan for industrial sector. And importantly, it's not an excuse for delay. If we have a hard to abate sector, what this plan helps us to do is to identify what policies we need to get into place to unlock investment today, rather than to delay. So again, briefly, the report also really captures how investors will use sector pathways. And this is important to feed into how these, or I should say sector plans, the pathways are just one important element that the Climate Change Authority will be developing, and they will help to support the overall plan. But how investors use plan to use these plans will help to inform how these plans are actually developed in the first place. There's 8 sort of areas that I won't go into all of them in the report. I'm happy to delve into any that there's particular questions on. But really understanding those emissions reduction goals at a national sector and sub-sector levels actually can really help with strategic decision-making and particularly engagement with companies on their transition plans, which will hopefully be informed by the UK TPT guidance and how that guidance feeds through in the Australian context. So actually providing a common local reference point for the sectors is really helpful in that engagement. It's really helpful for identifying and assessing potential investment risks and opportunities in real assets, and improving decision-making in those investments and listed, including in listed companies. And of course, it also provides a really comprehensive and granular reference point for engaging with governments on climate policy as well. And I'll just finish with the 8 investor expectations and design principles for sector plans that are set out in the report. Really critically, and I think many of these will align with the guidance for credible transition plannings around sort of action, ambition and accountability. There's the call to be Paris aligned, 1.5 degree aligned. It needs to all add up to that international objective that we're aiming for. Credible and internationally comparable, informed by deep consultation. So that element is really critical, and that's going to be the task over the next 12 months of government, and really encourage those on the call who are listening to this to be involved, or encourage those in your networks to be involved. Comprehensive, including considerations of the costs and climate damages, and again, great to see climate resilience coming into the work on corporate transition plans that Jacques mentioned too. Similarly, we want to see that sort of factored in and considered from the beginning of sector transition plans. It really needs to be action oriented, and I mentioned dynamic, so updated regularly. And consider the inherent sensitivities and uncertainties that will be at play. So it's not a fixed prediction of the future in any way, but really to understand those sensitivities and uncertainties that are inherent in the system. So that's it, Luke. That's the latest report, and we're really looking forward to following this and being closely involved over the next 12 months.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amy. It's a really important contribution at a moment where not just the climate department, but departments right across government are sort of getting their head around what this means and what they've been tasked with. And so having a clear articulation of what investors' expectations are is, I think, really helpful in terms of how they frame this up so that it can be useful for that important part of the economy, especially when we understand and know that the government is really looking to leverage private capital in this space coming in and making its contribution in the transition. So thank you for sharing that. So I'll let you have a little rest, because we're going to throw to your mate Tom over at ClimateWorks now. And Tom, I suppose one of the things that Amy was talking about, and is kind of implicit in Jacques' presentation, is how important the kind of emissions reductions that we can expect in each part of the economy are, and it's different in different parts of the economy. In some way, like a economy-wide target is important, but it's so crucial we get down to that granular level. And what ClimateWorks has done recently is made another contribution, an updated contribution to the kind of emissions reductions that we can plausibly contemplate here in Australia, both at an economy-wide and at a sectoral level. And as I understand it, there's a couple of key scenarios you've looked at, right? So do you want to take us through that?
Yes, thanks, Luke, and thanks to the panel and to the 30 or so eager beaver hardcore climate enthusiasts who join us at 7 p.m. on a Monday. So yeah, look, a few terms have been banded around on the call so far, maybe to give decarbonisation scenarios a bit more context. ClimateWorks Centre is an independent, not-for-profit research and advisory institution that operates within Monash University. Our latest publication goes even broader than what Amy was just referring to with the sectoral plans, but looking at whole of economy modelling. And it builds on more than a decade-long history of using scenario modelling to inform the debate around how Australia can get to net zero. Our model, AusTimes, explores how the Australian economy can decarbonise at the lowest cost according to a maximum carbon budget. The model is developed by ClimateWorks and CSIRO based on the globally recognised TIMES model from the International Energy Agency, the IEA. And our modelling provides an economy-wide view of the solutions to decarbonise each sector and their relative contributions to reducing emissions in a way that minimises overall costs across the whole economy. So what does it actually show? Well, it definitely shows that Australia can do its fair share of limiting global warming to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and decarbonise in line with the Paris Agreement. Our two scenarios that you referred to present the range of ambitions set out in that agreement, limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, with an overall aim of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, at the same time as increasing economic activity and meeting energy demand of the future. We found that Australia can reduce emissions by 85% by 2035 to stay in line with 1.5 degrees, or 61% by 2035 to stay in line with well below 2. There is growing consensus on the need to aim for 1.5 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But to achieve this, Australia would need to aim for net zero before 2040, more than a decade sooner than its current commitment of 2050. In terms of anchoring the content on today's discussion and thinking about the role that businesses in those different sectors need to play, our modelling offers a useful starting point for developing sectoral pathways, which they themselves provide helpful high-level guidance about how to decarbonise for business and government, either individually or even in a more overall coordinated way. We know that rapid decarbonisation of Australia's electricity system is particularly cost-effective, and it acts as an enabler for all the other sectors to do what they need to do. Our model sees us ending coal generation and reducing gas use and more than doubling renewable electricity generation by 2035. And the different sectors will need to decarbonise at a different pace, but the good news is that existing solutions already exist for all of them. Energy efficiency and electrification play a big role for buildings. In transport, electric vehicle sales make up over half of new car sales by 2030. Hydrogen can be used for industrial heat and feedstock. Agriculture and land emissions reduction can be achieved through changes to livestock feeds and fertilizers. And carbon dioxide removals play an important role, especially so in the more ambitious 1.5 degree scenario, but should not come at the expense of actual emissions reduction. And this is where transition plans come in. All businesses need to take the right actions to decarbonise, and larger corporates will have to disclose their plan more comprehensively to the market and their stakeholders in the way that Jacques set out. However, many of the current suite of transition plan frameworks, official or unofficial as they're emerging in countries, provide guidance on the quality and the completeness of the disclosure, but less so on the ambition of the targets or the credibility of the proposed actions. And this is where others are stepping in to fill that gap that Jacques mentioned. ClimateWorks Centre is working with over 90 individual experts from 40 leading global NGOs and standard setters in the Assessing Transition Plans Collective to build consensus on what counts as credible and develop guidance on how to assess the credibility of those transition plans. We will be releasing a report for public consultation in January 2024 and would welcome the input of many on this call and look forward to releasing the work finally in May next year. A key element, as Amy alluded to in the recent excellent IGCC report, is that sectoral pathways are a very strong foundation on which to base a transition plan. So to demonstrate climate leadership, a credible transition plan needs to align with a credible pathway, for which the likes of GFANZ and OECD and others have recently published their perspectives on. Along with our work, there is increasing development and adoption of region or country-specific pathways, which we would encourage viewers of this webinar to refer to. Being rooted in the geographic and system dependencies on the ground provides greater specificity for a company's implementation strategy, its technology choices, its capital allocation, and its engagement strategy. And country-appropriate carbon budgets also better reflect fair share and principles of just transition and equity when it comes to balancing the expectations of developed as opposed to developing economies. To close, demonstrating a credible transition plan is no longer a nice to have. We're operating in a changing landscape. Fundamentally, the world and the corporate sector remains off track, and we'll see that more and more with exploring the global stocktaker COP. But thankfully, there is growing momentum towards credible action and collaboration. The Australian Climate Leaders Coalition provides an environment for solving problems that cannot be addressed by individual corporates alone. And as Purdie will probably cover in more detail, the Australian Treasury has indicated that it will introduce new disclosure guidance on transition plans as part of their sustainable finance strategy to align with the other proposed climate financial reporting commencing in FY 24-25. And given the extent to which sustainability now cuts across all aspects of the company's core strategy, these plans will form an essential part of your company's risks and opportunities assessment, particularly to mitigate greenwashing. Thanks, Luke.
Hey, thank you, Tom, and thanks to the whole ClimateWorks team. Again, incredibly timely contribution just to create a new independent baseline of what credibility looks like in this space. That's important, obviously, for the companies to understand, for their sector, what a reasonable pathway looks like. It's also important for the government to have that sort of that independent set of metrics as it considers both the sectoral decarbonisation plans, but also importantly, the next nationally determined contribution for 2035. Right. So it's important work and we appreciate it. You can now take a rest because I'm going to throw to your colleague, Purdie. Now, Purdie, of course, from the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. I mean, Tom's really done my job for me. He already half introduced you on the way in, Purdie. I understand you're going to provide some context on some of the key developments that have been happening in the finance space, particularly some of those consultations coming out of Treasury and what the implications for this agenda might be.
Yeah, thanks, Luke, and seamless work, Tom. Love your work. Hi, everyone. So Tom mentioned the Australian Sustainable Finance Strategy. This is the government's plan for how it's going to put in place policies and regulations that encourage the finance investment we need to meet Australia's climate and broader sustainability goals over time, and also to adequately manage the sustainability-related risks across the financial system. So until quite recently, the Australian government had been pretty missing in action on sustainable finance, and that's in contrast to their partners in other countries, including the EU, who was at the forefront, also the UK, Singapore, New Zealand, even to an extent the US, who have been getting busy on sustainable finance for some years now. In Australia, the activity in this space was very much led by industry until December last year, when the Australian Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, announced an intention to develop a whole of government sustainable finance strategy. Earlier this month, Treasury made good on that commitment and published a consultation paper on the proposed sustainable finance strategy. So it's a meaty document. It covers a range of different areas, and it's going to do a lot to bring Australia up to speed with other key economies, which is really important for many reasons, but including for our members. So our members are financial institutions across the entire finance sector, banking, investment, insurance, and financial services. And they were pretty concerned that Australia was not kind of adequately managing the risks related to climate. It was going to be left behind and was going to cut off its access to well-priced international capital. So very pleasing to see this strategy being developed. It's very much focused on climate for now, but the government has clearly signalled in this paper that over time it'll look to follow the emerging international developments, which are expanding into other sustainability-related issues. So I just wanted to mention that. Down the pipeline, you can see similar kind of frameworks developing for nature and ultimately for social impacts and social outcome. So the strategy sets out 12 priority areas for reform and action, and some of these were announced already earlier this year in April and are very much underway. And one of those is a sustainable finance taxonomy, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. The other one big piece is the climate-related financial disclosures, which Tom spoke to, which will come into effect for the first group of companies mid-next year and be phased in for other companies over 4 years. Another one that's already underway is the development of a sovereign green bond framework. So the Australian government will issue its first green bonds by mid next year. There's also some new things in the paper, and I guess relevant to Jacques' presentation and to this webinar is priority 3, which is about supporting credible transition planning. So this was fantastic to see, especially in particular, there's a shout out to the UK TPT and the transition plan guidance. It was great that Jacques could be here earlier in the year and kind of really share with the government and others about what was happening over there in the UK. And this guidance has been certainly instrumental in kind of setting the gold standard of transition planning. So what they're doing on the transition plans is in the disclosure requirements that I mentioned earlier, there will be a requirement for companies to disclose key elements of transition plans. So that's very much aligned with the global ISSB disclosure standards. Next year, ASIC will clarify what its expectations are for what company transition plan disclosure should be. And then the government at the same time will run a consultation on the need for further requirements and guidance to support businesses to develop and disclose high quality transition plans. So the intent there is to really develop high quality and internationally aligned transition planning practices and reporting requirements to better inform the market and support the flow of transition finance. That's a direct quote. The other new thing in the paper is the development of a labelling system for investment products that are marketed as sustainable, I guess more relevant for the finance sector audience than your real economy audience, but an interesting development that again will kind of bring Australia into line with other economies. It's not all about policy and regulation though. There's government sort of looked quite broadly across the set of tools that it has at its disposal to encourage investment consistent with the net zero transition in particular. And they've asked a question about what more the Clean Energy Finance Corporation could do if it had an expanded mandate. So putting it out there that we could get the CFC to do work in more areas, including right now it has an emissions reduction mandate. Could it do adaptation resilience? Could it go even further? Could it do nature financing and help to build those markets in the same way that it's done, a lot of work over the last 10 years to build a kind of climate-related markets and support investment into particularly renewables. The final thing is that I was very pleased in particular about was that there's a whole section that focuses on international engagement. And this was fantastic to see that they want to position, the government is seeking to position Australia as a leader internationally on sustainable finance and to deepen its engagement with partner countries and in kind of global fora that do the development of sustainable finance frameworks. We really see that as an encouraging step that will support global progress on sustainability. That will also help our neighbours who are grappling with some of the same transition struggles that we are, and really leverage the work that we're doing domestically now as we move into more of a leadership position, particularly on things like the taxonomy, to support that global movement. And also, I guess, particularly for businesses that are operating in this space, ensure that we are influencing the development of those international frameworks so that they meet Australia's particular interests and they can be accommodated easily within our system. I want to note, and this kind of goes to Amy's point on the transition, on the sector decarbonisation plans, that this is sustainable finance policy. It's really important. It's not a silver bullet. So one of the biggest drivers of finance and investment is those real economy policies like the safeguard mechanism, like genuine targets and then genuine policies to meet those targets. So those sector decarbonisation plans will be a critical piece that will also drive capital, and we'll really need to see everything that Amy said come forth in those plans.
Thank you, Purdie. That there's a lot going on. We haven't even got to the taxonomy, but maybe we'll sort of weave that in the discussion. I will give you one little break, and then because I'm going to get my colleague Holly Taylor in, but it'll be a short break, Purdie, because we will be bringing the panel back in just a moment. So, Holly, there you go. You've been nerding out there in the background now for a little over an hour. No doubt you've been enjoying yourself.
Nerding out is the best way to describe my activities this evening. Suffice to say that Tom says, there's 30 or so people here. A couple of hundred people have registered because this is not just an interesting topic to me. This is an interesting topic to lots of people. But, generally on a Monday evening in Australia, people don't like dialing into a nerdy webinar. But critically, we're all here because we do like dialing into a nerdy webinar. So thanks for those that came in live.
Indeed. I can imagine there's people with earbuds in, listening attentively while doing the dishes right around the country. There is an important element to this that we haven't touched on yet, which is kind of the people that we need to drive this transition, and also the kind of literacy we need to build and the upskilling we need to do, so that businesses, but also the advisors that they work with have the information they need to leverage these sorts of frameworks. Do you have any thoughts on that, Holly?
Anyone that's paying attention to the EEC's social media and mine might be expecting me to talk about careers for net zero. But before I do, I just critically want to say there is no one on this call, not you, Luke, not me, not any of our esteemed speakers, that are across everything that everyone's just been talking about. There is so much to get done. There is so much upskilling that needs to happen across the whole economy that we really do need to think about how can we support the workforce, and that's Australia's entire workforce, the world's entire workforce, with supporting net zero. And of course, that is why the EEC and the CEC and the lovely organisations here in Australia, being ClimateWorks, ASFI and IGCC, have supported the Careers for Net Zero campaign, because we're trying to drive more people into careers across the clean economy. And I say clean economy because I'm critically picking up on the themes that everyone's talked through. This is not just about getting us to net zero emissions. It's about ensuring that we have biodiversity. It's about ensuring that we have a just transition. It's about ensuring that we don't have modern slavery, and we have a future in which we want to live in and we want our children and grandchildren to live in. And unfortunately, we can't just snap our fingers and make it happen. I think the vast majority of people would love that outcome, but unfortunately, we need to roll up our sleeves and get the job done. But the good news is that there are so many different careers out there that are involved in basically helping businesses decarbonize, that we all can get involved and we can play and do the things that we enjoy as we're going along. So a critical way to think about this is that obviously accountants, when we're talking about climate-related financial disclosure, are going to be critical to getting us there. Who would have thought that accountants are going to be critical to supporting us with getting to net zero? 10 years ago, no one would have thought this except for maybe a few nerds in the Bank of England. But they are essential, and Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand is developing training to support accountants with getting up to speed. And many other organisations around the country are developing training, and it's just something that we need to roll out. So I would encourage anyone that's thinking about how can we support businesses with decarbonising to go to careersfornetzero.org.au. You can look up a net zero business advisor, which is the critical role for getting us there, but we will have profiles for accountants and everything else that we need up. And right now we've got engineers, we've got policy advisors, and all of these roles are so critical to helping not just businesses decarbonise, but the entirety of not just Australia's economy, but the global economy.
Great. A passionate call for people to flood this sector and help us get the job done. Thank you, Holly. I'll invite everybody now to turn their screen's on. We've got some questions flowing in the chat, and I might throw this one to you, Jacques, because it's a good one. There's a question from Brendan on, you know, what one might do when you're facing a particular unique situation and you don't necessarily have, you know, sector guidance to guide your pathway forward. So the scenario he's imagining is one where, you know, there's a nascent technology which is being development. It's at a low TRL, technology readiness level, and the only current route for that technology is offsets. Like, how does one think about that? And then I suppose, you know, maybe as to jump off that that specific question, to generalize it, obviously not every business in the entire world is covered by your sectoral guidance. So, you know, how are you thinking? Where are the gaps, and how are you thinking about what businesses that don't see themselves in those sectoral guidance documents should do?
Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Brendan, for the question. So I think I'm probably going to answer this in probably more general terms, because I'm not going to be aware of the specific example. But I think probably what a transition plan essentially is laying out your plan to support the economy-wide transition. So if you know there is a particular technology that you think is crucial to that requires support from other parts of the economy or from government, then it's sort of setting that out and explaining why and what conditions are needed. And you know, if that is heavily reliant on offsets, it's kind of explaining why also, and how that supports your own transition and crucially the economy-wide transition. So it's a bit of a sort of get out answer, because, you know, I'm not kind of aware of your particular situation. But I think it's transparency with explanation that is going to be key, rather than sort of, at the moment, I think this current situation is companies are sort of saying, well, we're going to do this, we're not really going to tell you why or how it's important. And I think similar concept applies to, you know, tricky questions around how financed emissions may need to go up in the short term, but without providing an explanation of why that might be and how that supports the transition, it could be seen as contrary to the transition.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's incredibly powerful, that innovation in the TPT around having to set out your contribution to the overall economic transition, which we could spend half an hour just on that, but we won't because we don't have time. I have another question here on which I'll throw to the whole panel. Anyone that wants to pick this up. Amanda is asking, what is the role of scenario analysis once government establishes sector pathways? So I guess just what I imagine Amanda's driving at is that there's then one pathway which is defined at a point in time, both for sectors and at an economy-wide level. You know, obviously scenario analysis is pretty powerful in terms of unpacking, you know, if one twiddles this knob that, and what the outcomes could be and what might be possible. You know, how does that work in a world where we've got these set sectoral decarb pathways? Who wants to chip in on that?
Luke, I'm happy to jump in, and I'm sure others will have plenty to say. It's a really good question, and it does come back to the purpose of, what is the purpose of scenario analysis, and what role does it play? And already I think companies are using scenario analysis for all sorts of different reasons. But for the context of you know, climate-related disclosures for investors and for informing transition plans and your business resilience, I think that they play separate roles. The sector plans could provide one common sort of 1.5 degree aligned scenario that you're tracking, that you're sort of considering. But generally investors or the expectation is to see a range of scenarios considered, a range of challenging scenarios to test a whole variety of different outcomes. It's important, like, for example, the Network for Greening Finance, it's NGFS scenarios. They provide a 1.5 degree aligned scenario for an orderly transition, but also what does an alternative disorderly transition look like, a delayed disorderly. So considering how these different things might play out is still really important. And then the other element that perhaps we haven't touched on so much is also considering the physical risk aspects that are very uncertain. And so considering how do those climate impacts play out, scenarios will continue to be really important and won't be factored in to those plans.
Right. All right. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to whip around the panel and ask a question, which you can take in a couple of ways. I'm interested in, what's coming up at COP28. If you want to chip on that, things that you're watching for, or whether you think is particularly important for us to be conscious of as we're heading into the next couple of weeks. Huge amount going on at COP these days, and so helpful to have that guidance on what we should be watching for. Or if you don't have something to say about COP, something that you're looking to in 2024, something we should keep our eyes out for, because my expectation is that activity is just going to keep accelerating in this space, and there's going to be even more happening in 2024 than there was in 2023. So I might start with you, Purdie. Take it where you will.
Sure, thank you. I will be joining you at COP28, but I will take the second interpretation of that question, which is what's on the horizon for 2024. And the thing I want to mention, which I mentioned very briefly, but is the sustainable finance taxonomy that is being developed for Australia. Very quickly, a taxonomy is a set of common definitions that defines what is sustainable and what is not, and for climate, what is green and what is not. Australia is developing one. We're the first 3 sectors underway. Ideally, we'll have the first 6 sectors done by the end of next year. And why this is important for kind of transition planning is because the taxonomy provides a way for companies that are developing transition plans to understand what the transition plan trajectory should be. It takes the pathways and scenarios developed by people like ClimateWorks, and it says, okay, for each activity across the entire economy, this is what you should be at in terms of emissions intensity by this date. Importantly, it has a transition category as well as a green category. Some things very clearly green, other things, as the earlier question was kind of directed at, may take a bit longer to develop those technologies to transition. That takes that into account by having that kind of amber category, which demonstrates you're high emitting now, but you're going to get there. You're important in 2050, and this is the trajectory you should be on.
I'm so glad you're doing that work. Also because I don't have to do it. It's really hard work, but it's so important.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And important to know that you started on this journey, but subsequently the Australian government has backed it in and is supporting you doing that important work and getting all the stakeholders together. So fantastic leadership from ASFI and partnership with the federal government. Tom, what's exercising your mind as we head into the next period?
I'll be brave and try and answer all of the previous questions in one go with my response. And in terms of looking ahead to COP, I'll just throw out some random words. I'm sure others can build on it more, but looking forward to seeing nature being brought in more, along with just transition. I think a greater focus on regional finance and fairness and what that looks like. But for us, the real key word is credibility, like we talked about in my presentation earlier, and that's really what we'll be focusing on for next year, what that looks like for Australia, and how to bring in those country-specific pathways. And to answer the question on scenarios that came up just then, I mean, at the moment, the Australian government target isn't in line with 1.5, and hopefully that will change if there's work that we and others can do now to help influence and guide and educate about what that looks like. That's going to be awesome, and we hope to see more of that emerging over the coming years. But the devil's in the detail. I think you really need to understand what the pathways are that's being hung off, and there are often multiple pathways and options to get there. So along with the intent of the IGCC report, really hoping for clarity and consistency in the market. Investors need a clear signal and one source of truth, ideally. But we'll have to see how that plays out. But to Purdie's point, the sustainable finance strategy, we think, can be showcased at COP. If you look at what Australia is about to have to play with in terms of the overall system architecture that the likes of IMF and World Bank and others are advocating for globally. You've got mandatory disclosures, you've got sectoral plans and decarbonisation pathways, you've got a world-leading taxonomy that might be one of the first to really integrate with those pathways. I think actually it's an incredible opportunity to demonstrate regional leadership, and not just at this COP, but the ones to follow shortly as well. So excited to see how all that goes down with an international audience.
It's incredible how quickly things are moving. Tom, thank you. Amy, what about you? What's exercising your mind as we look ahead?
I'm just going to come back to your opening comment, Luke, that it's critical to use every tool in the toolbox. So I think we've touched on some really critical elements, including sector plans, and we need to get them all in place and keep front of mind at that place-based approach as well, how we're looking after people in the regions, and setting up for a really successful transition along the way.
Right. Jacques, how about you, mate?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I'm going to echo a lot of what people have said. There's three things that really come to mind. So the first is the language of transition plans being used increasingly by companies feeling confident to talk about how they're going to support the transition, and that just being embedded a lot more within the COP process. So the second point is how the UN is going to start looking at transition plans, and as Tom said, the issues around credibility. We know that the global stocktake is going to be bad this year. How is the UN thinking about how private sector transitions and ambitions contribute towards that? And the third thing is countries setting out commitments on disclosures, on sustainable finance, on transition plans, like Australia is doing. I think, I really agree that Australia can showcase this at COP and to demonstrate itself as a leader, and that other countries will get behind that sort of ambition, because ultimately we need the countries setting out the policy environments and making the regulatory commitments in a pivot to a more mandatory space.
Thank you, Jacques. And Holly, bring us home.
So I'm going to tie us back into Jacques' opening presentation and indeed the key principles of the TPT. Ambition, action, and accountability. Yes, we might be going into a COP that we're maybe not expecting as much ambition from governments as we'd like to see, but we're here tonight, or this morning with Jacques, talking about credible business decarbonisation. And I feel pretty confident that at COP28 and in 2024, we are going to see a massive ratcheting up of ambition and action from businesses around the world, and then the accountability that comes with that. I'm really excited, which is such a nerdy thing to say with what's about to follow, that, from July 1st next year, we have climate-related financial disclosure Australia, or in Australia. We most likely will, we don't have the regs in just yet, but that's coming, and that's really exciting. And definitely, fingers crossed, Purdie, this is going to give us accountability. And, if we're drawing on the lessons learned from our wonderful energy efficiency sector, we're looking at businesses that have disclosed their neighbours' rating, their neighbours' energy rating over a 14-year period. It's just disclosure that have on average a 42% reduction in their energy consumption. The massive ramp up that we're about to have in terms of accountability of forcing businesses to disclose their climate-related financial disclosure, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as transition plans. This is a really exciting time. This is going to ripple throughout the entire economy, not just in Australia, but globally. So what am I looking forward to seeing at my first COP ever, which is super exciting for me, is ambition, action, and accountability from all the businesses around the world. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that ramp up even more in 2024.
Thank you, Holly. Well said. And thank you to all of our panelists, Tom, Purdie, Amy, and Jacques. It is a pleasure sort of collaborating with all of your organisations. It is incredibly heartening that there's such a clear shared vision from all these different parts of the economy, and not just our organisations, many others that are actively collaborating on this effort. And I think collectively we can be proud of the way that the language of transition planning has been taken up by the federal government, and is being reflected in some of those consultation documents that we were talking about earlier. Still more work to do, as all of you have said, but we've made a good start, and looking forward to continue to collaborate with all of you. All of these organisations will be represented at COP28 in one form or another, and so I encourage everybody on the call to be watching their feeds and over the next 2 weeks, but also over the coming year as we continue to look to catalyse the transition that we know we all need. But with that, I trust that's been a short, sharp and helpful survey of what's been a very busy year. There'll be more from us soon, but for now, it's goodbye from us, and we'll be seeing you soon from Dubai.